And so that, that kind of leads me, Juan, into, you know, a modern central bank role. Um, what should the mandate be for a central bank in a market-oriented democratic Cuba?
Perfect. I will gladly talk about that. And when I was at the Fed, and in the last few years, I was giving a lot of speeches, and I had to follow a script. You had to be very careful at the Fed on your wording, whatever you said. And my last year, I got in trouble a few times because I had lived a lot. But after 40 years, they weren't going to do anything. But Washington would call me and I'd say this and that. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to take that posture. I've been retired 14 years and I can say whatever pretty much the hell I want, but not on this. I think it's critical when I present this. I looked at what worked at the Fed and what works for an independent bank. So I will talk a little bit about the key principles that I believe are important in transition lessons relevant to a design of a modern Cuban banking system in a post-authoritarian market-oriented context. I drew on comparative experiences from post-communist and emerging markets. When Russia fell, we trained at the Federal Reserve 30 Russian bankers that couldn't spell banking if you put all the letters in a row, but we worked with them and told them the basics and worked through that over time. Now, one thing, whenever I talk about the modern central bank, and I will mention this regardless of what question Adolfo asked me, the primary focus that I have on a new modern central bank in Cuba or anywhere is complete independence from fiscal policies. That's what's worked for us over 100 years in the United States. And here's what I believe a future Cuban central bank should be established with clear, very direct, and legally protected mandates. Key principles. The primary objective of a new central bank's got to be price stability for the country. That's paramount. That's got to be the first thing. Secondary is a financial system stability. You have to make sure when you deal with other countries in the hemisphere or around the world that they view the new central bank as financial system very stable. And like I mentioned before, and I'll mention this probably 10 times through the presentation, operational independence. From the fiscal side, like the treasury of our government, that's our fiscal side. The Federal Reserve in this government is monetary policy. Fiscal policy and political authority needs to be independent of the central bank. That is going to be the key for us going forward. Like our Federal Reserve is now. No matter what a president says in the United States about, regardless of the political party, independence of the Federal Reserve or the new central bank in Cuba has to be independent of political pressure. And that's what has worked. International experience demonstrates that monetary credibility in a post-transition economies that will happen in Cuba depends on prohibitions on direct deficit financing. Got to be clear on that. Transparent policy frameworks and data publication. You need to inform the public of what's happening in the central bank. Data is important not only for what's happening internally in the country, but what's happening to your trading partners and your future individuals that you're going to be dealing with. Clear lender of last resort. That's what the Fed has to be in a financial system. That's the discount window at the Federal Reserve Bank. We had to bail out banks, particularly during the crisis, and they had to go through the discount window. That's got to be a key in the new central bank going forward. The central bank should not function as an instrument of fiscal accommodation. Again, separation of duties. Fiscal side with the Treasury on one side, monetary policy on the other side. or industrial policy. The legitimacy will derive predictably for an institutional restart and adhere to rules, clear rules of how the new central bank would process.
Thank you. That leads me to something that we were talking about a little earlier, which is the last strategic plan for a potential change in Cuba by the Federal Reserve was done while you were there. You've been gone for a while.
Yeah.
What would the role be? What would happen here? And what lessons have we learned from what happened in other communist countries that have changed?
Well, we were prepared, and of course, I was the only Cuban at the Federal Reserve in a higher position at that time. And a lot of bank presidents in Miami were Latin or Cuban. And whenever people would gather in Versailles, they would call me. And one bank president called me one time at 2:30 in the morning. I told him, "You call me whenever you want." Well, he did. And he said, "We need to have a meeting because we think something's going to happen in Cuba." Well, as we learned throughout history, nothing has happened. And I was responsible for doing the strategic plan if anything happened in Cuba. Back to a little bit of history of the Federal Reserve. There were two Federal Reserves in Cuba for a long time, starting in the 1920s. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston handled cables, which are now known as wire transfers, because Bank of Boston International, the second biggest branch outside of Bank of Boston International, was in Cuba in the 1920s. So that's why Boston was there. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, which I reported to from the Miami branch, handled currency all through Cuba. As a matter of fact, one time they sent in the 40s a shipment from Jacksonville, because there was no Miami branch, of U.S. currency to Cuba. The branch manager from Jacksonville went with the shipment, met a Cuban lady, and married her. So there's a long history of the Federal Reserve Bank there. And we're now the only Fed responsible, meaning the Atlanta branch. So I left, I retired 12-12-12 from the Fed, and the last strategic plan was done in 2010. This is my only time in recent years that we think something is potential in happening in Cuba. So I called my former colleagues that are still there in Atlanta, and I said, "Listen, let me remind you that the Federal Reserve in Atlanta is responsible for Cuba. If something happens and we need to get dollars into that country immediately," and the dollars in Cuba, the Cuban peso back in the 40s and 50s was the same value as the US dollar. So that's why dollars transmitted through Cuba just on par with the Cuban peso. So we need to be ready. Well, I called Atlanta, and unfortunately, they had no clue that responsibility, and their senior officers now involved in looking what we need to do just in case it falls. So,
Fernando, you.
Yeah, let me just add, thank you, Adolfo. I just want to add a footnote to something that Juan said. In 1920, just to give you an idea of the banking system, the way it had in Cuba, in 1920, Citibank of New York, City National Bank of New York, had 80% of the bank's capital in New York, or the main office, was tied up in Cuba in loans. The branch they had in Cuba, because they had branches all over the island, it was the largest branch system anywhere in the world. It was larger than the branches of Citibank in London, Buenos Aires, Mexico City. So it was a huge presence that they had in Cuba. And that was only Citibank. Chase, Bank of Boston were also, as Juan pointed out, very large. And that's the reason why we had two branches of Federal Reserve Bank in Havana, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, as Juan pointed out, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks. Juan, before I leave you, when you look at Cuba today, very few of the people there really have experience with what we see as traditional banking, and how do we, what would be the best approach to ensuring that things like corruption that have plagued other emerging markets and, you know, other things like digital payments and mobile banking and so on, how could we actually bring that in and avoid problems?
Well, first, to answer the question on what happens when a new bank comes in, the first thing we need to have is great supervision. And I know when we were in the banks, whenever we had the supervisors come in, we go, oh man, 3 weeks. But it's key. It's key. And dismantling what they have now, we need to have, I don't know if they have any loans whatsoever, but we need to get rid of all those. Legacy non-performing assets should be as quickly as possible, done away with. Transparency identified immediately, and remove through asset management and bad bank mechanism, and start over. Create a new central bank. Do away dismantling the old model. Delaying recognition of these losses, and it'll repeat the same thing over again. So that has to be done in an immediate basis. As far as fintech and the payments, we have an advantage there because they haven't had a payment system in so many years that we're leapfrogging all the paper, all the checks, everything. Everything is going to be digital finance with potential benefits, including, now, here's the thing, rapid expansion in the financial inclusion. Going to electronics will make it immediately. Reduce cash dependency, and that's going to be a key because the model of cash for Cuba, what's it going to be? It's sure as heck not going to be the peso because nobody in the world is going to trade with something that they don't know any value. So you're going to either have to put in a dollarization, which a lot of countries have done. Even when I was at the Fed, El Salvador changed from their currency to dollars, Panama dollars. So it's got to be dollars or euros going in there. Of course, the most logical is going to be dollars. The Fed in Miami is ready, has the cash ready to provide, but that has to be reduced. So improve transparency and fiscal capacity by going to electronics. Now, I know one of the things that we're talking about that's also going to be important is a clear regulatory framework. That's going to have to be a key. The payment system will work, and there's a lot of areas that it's already covered. But interoperable payment system, strong consumer protection standards need to be in place, and a credible monetary anchor. All that because you're going to have to trade. People are going to build the infrastructure in Cuba. All that has to be in place. Now, one of my concerns is AI. AI is a very strong product. However, in the institution that Al and I are involved with, whenever we're creative and whenever I see somebody implementing something on AI, and that's going to be paramount in Cuba, you better have a cybersecurity component on the other side, or I personally will not approve it.
Mm-hmm.
We see things every day in that arena that is critical. So that is one of my concerns going forward. Probably took longer than I needed to, but it's critical to me.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that thought.
Morning. First, I want to thank FIU, Julio, and all of you for having us over. It's indeed a privilege to be chatting with you all here today about this topic, one that I followed for a very long time. We're going to, I'm going to give you a Cliff Note version of this due to time. So we're going to publish our findings. We've done a survey that goes back to Nuremberg. And once the conference is over, you'll be able to download it. What I want to do with you here this morning, though, is go through some themes that come from all these cases and hopefully set you up with a framework that can be used in the case of Cuba. And so before we dive into Cuba's future, let's reckon a little bit with the past, especially as it relates to justice and accountability. What does that mean? For example, at the end of World War II, nation states had contacts with their adversaries. So we did have tribunals at Nuremberg to hold those to account, deemed as architects or implementers of the Holocaust and the World War II atrocities before the end of the war. But Allied powers during that time were reaching out to the Nazis to ascertain steps of surrender, post-war, and beyond. Nuremberg was not a mystery to the future Nazis, and in fact, it was used as leverage before the end of the war. The Nuremberg tribunals were followed by individual trials elsewhere. The Nazis were broadly shunned from civil society, but the party itself was not put on trial directly at Nuremberg. There's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about it during the questions and answers. So even as Americans were directly involved in the liberation of concentration camps in European nations, American jurists spearheaded accountability efforts at Nuremberg. The U.S. had contacts with the Reich and other officials, such as scientists, and I'll get back to that in a minute, why this is important. These contacts were critical to U.S. interests during the post-World War II period, such as our space program, missile and nuclear program, to defend, deter, and counter Soviet Union communist bloc aggression during the Cold War. Just as past national decisions shaped our space program and some accountability was secondary, so will our choices shape Cuba's future, but with significant guardrails that we'll talk about in 1 second. Will the Cuban people allow the Cuban Communist Party a seat at a table in a new Cuba after decades of repression? I don't believe they should, but that's a question up to the Cuban people. As Cubans stand up to this new launch pad, let's ensure that what we build is freedom without shadows of the past. The first time I saw an American president in person was right here in Miami in 1983. Ronald Reagan was visiting for a lunch and a rally. I was 13 years old back then. I'm 56 now. 43 years later, that debate that centers on the same questions that Reagan was talking about are still relevant today. Cold War realities such as the Soviets may no longer exist, but the red thread of communism still does at a global level, and Cuba is right in the middle of it. So the future of the Communist Party in Cuba is going to be very critical to the reset that Reagan was talking about back in 1983. And you can read that in what Reagan was talking about because he talked about that issue. See, at the heart of what this panel and others at the conference I've been listening to have been talking about is bigger than the Communist Party of Cuba, or whether or not we should ban it, exclude it, or otherwise prohibit Cuba Communist Party from political life. It's about the kind of Cuba Cubans want to build moving forward, grounded on respect for the individual, private property, and the rule of law. For years, I have said the political future belongs to the Cuban people. And in my view, this question should be decided in Cuba as a first principle. They have earned that right to make it so without outsiders telling them what to do. In my opinion, there should not be a UN tribunal. There should not be an OAS tribunal. In fact, I would dare say there should not even be foreign lawyers trying to guide that process. I've had the honor of working with many Cuban lawyers the past 10 years, and there are many eager to do it inside the island, and I think we all have a chance at doing that. A country that has lived under one-party system for decades will eventually confront some very hard questions about political participation, accountability, and legitimacy. Those answers cannot be imposed by outsiders. And in many same way that Reagan talked about what is the next best hope for the Western Hemisphere, I believe starts and ends with this discussion as it relates to the communist global system. As an American lawyer, the idea of banning a political party triggers a lot of skepticism. The American political system is built on the premise that ideas, even dangerous ideas, are defeated through debate, law, elections, not prohibition. We protect speech, we protect association, we distrust ideological exclusion. Yet this journey was unique to us, and every nation's past in tackling these tough issues belongs to those nations. We had a civil war followed by Reconstruction. We tackled it then. Yet our nation has not banned political parties, as is happening in parts of Europe today, or banished them as was done centuries ago. Again, it's unique to the American system. But when you examine the recent historical record, a lot of what you can review in the survey that we prepared, you find that some democracies have banned political parties under very tight, specific circumstances after significant periods of trauma, such as the former Eastern Bloc countries, the post-Franco tolerance laws during the terrorism crackdown in Spain, the Heri Batasuna cases. And in some cases, nation states have blocked nation states from the international system, which I find peculiar to Cuba that it hasn't happened. Acting through the UN system, the UN members treated Franco's Spain as an outlier after World War II. Spain was excluded from UN membership in the post-war period. It only happened in 1955 that they were welcomed in because there was political utility of doing so to defeating the communists. Post-war Germany has developed the doctrine of defensive democracy. It allows courts to prohibit parties that sought to abolish constitutional order itself. Post-Soviet states have imposed restrictions on former ruling parties during fragile democratic transition. Spain dissolved political formations linked to terrorism in recent history, not because of ideology alone, but because of demonstrable operational ties to violence, linked in history and linked to actual activity today. And even in the European human rights system, the European courts have accepted that in exceptional cases, we can, through democratic self-defense, justify exclusion of a group of people, provided it is evidence-based, judicially supervised, and proportionate. Across these cases we reviewed with a Cuban lawyer, we did all this work with a former Cuban lawyer and judge, one principle emerges: prescription is not justified by belief alone, but by due process, institutional function, or by a law designed for that purpose in a free society. You have to ban a party and ban a party clearly under rules that are set forth in a free society. But there's some things you could do beforehand, which I'll talk about one second, that I think could help that process along. Decisions who can participate in public life are at the core politically grave and moral decisions, questions of constitutional self-preservation and civic legitimacy. Today is the communist, tomorrow who knows. The moral danger and moral hazard of political exclusion is ancient. Scripture is blunt about what it means to be cast out. Genesis gives us the first example of an expulsion, and in Daniel 4 we show how a ruler was driven from power until he recognizes there is a law above his own will. But there are stories, and there are many more. The focus has to be always bound in law. We don't want to fall back and provide the conditions for a process that is similar to what was done in Cuba in 1959. And I agree with my colleague, the Communist Party has roots that plotting to undermine the Cuban Republic since way before then. So we have a rich history. It's how we get there. When a society tries to settle political accounts without law, it cannot get accountability. It gets score setting. And in worst cases, the country fractures. Look at places like Colombia, where unresolved grievances and weak institutions helped feed an insurgency and decades of internal conflict. In Nicaragua, which I think is a better example, the Sandinistas escaped true accountability and justice. They, quote, elected their way back into power, and look at what is happening in Nicaragua today. One of the lessons is that exclusion, if it is to be legitimate, must be evidence-based and tightly cabined. The time to talk about this is now, not when there's a leadership crisis in Cuba. And Americans can play and have been playing an important role in that process. When a political organization uses the machinery of state to eliminate rivals and impose a mandatory ideological framework on a people, then put them in a box, then compete through the ballot box, you're inflicting profound injuries on natural law and fundamental rights. This raises a difficult sequencing question that responsible nations, starting with the US, must start working on now. America has thought through this quite a bit. In the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, or the Libertad Act, or called Helms-Burton, we have guardrails, a lot of guardrails, that talk about the Communist Party's role in the future Cuba. Under US law, for example, the US government is supposed to deny visas to Cuban nationals who are officers or employees of the Cuban government or the Communist Party, but we're not doing that. We are supposed to not do business with system-controlled companies or those trafficking in property stolen from Americans and Cubans. So why are we not enforcing those laws? Because by every law we do not enforce, we are sending a signal to people in Cuba that we don't take this seriously. And that's laying a predicate for what we can or cannot do in the Cuba of tomorrow when it comes to removing certain people from civic life. Why have we not indicted Raul Castro and others who have killed Americans? The American people do not want our homeland turned into a haven for Cuban communists, war criminals, or genocidaires. One of the reasons the U.S. maintains dedicated capacity in this space is to ensure America does not become a haven for human rights abusers. In the Department of Homeland Security, there is a whole unit dedicated to exposing and expelling human rights violators, including at the War Crimes Center. These people are experts in identifying, investigating, and pursuing those who have committed grave violations of human rights, who have later sought to do refuge here. Engagement or recognition without accountability or tangible, verifiable contrition or course correction can function to politically and historically act as a kind of absolution. And that is where the legal and moral tension lies. In the Cuba context, U.S. law operates as a light guardrail, guardrails we did not have in Nuremberg. It reflects Congress's judgment, meaning the American people's judgment, that normalization should not amount to quiet waiver of responsibility for gross violation of human rights, property confiscation, or teaming with our adversaries and other abuses in the inter-American system. I'm going to wrap up because I'm running out of time, but I will talk about this in the Q&A. We have to keep in mind that the Cuban Communist Party is still committed to the system, the communist system. That hasn't changed. To my knowledge, not one single official of the Cuban Communist Party has ever openly discussed contrition, much less changing their ways. In my opinion, they have forfeited their right as a matter of international law and Cuban law. And I spoke to many Cuban lawyers about this. There is a legal pathway in Cuba to do this. And certain people should not be allowed to participate in Cuban civil society. Now, the U.S. needs to make a better take of the laws that we have. Societies emerging from totalitarian rule, which is happening today, has these twin temptations that we saw in German cases and the Eastern Bloc cases. You normalize too quickly, you erase memory. Or you exclude too broadly, you will undermine pluralism. The challenge is to do neither. The Cuban case, as all cases we have reviewed, is unique. Its solutions should not be imported from Germany, Spain, or Eastern Europe. They need to come from Cuban society itself, from the Cuban experience, through open debate, even with people we do not like, institutional development, and constitutional design. Accountability will precede legitimacy. Accountability begins with record building, documentation, victim testimony, archival preservation, building cases, something very painstaking that's already underway, but that we have to do a lot more of. So I wrap up, I have a minute. Let me skip over a few things. I'm going along. A Cuban doctor once shared with me what this process needs to look like. And he compared it to political debridement. It's when you are helping someone who's suffering a severe burn. And if you know, that process can be very painful. But he compared it to exactly that process. It means that we must confront the corruption, dismantle the compromised structures, remove layers and layers of decay that have piled up for centuries, for decades. And it's going to hurt, and it will provoke resistance. But without it, you will leave an infection that cannot be removed without this type of sunshine. Mercy without truth becomes sentimentality. Amnesty without justice becomes complicity. A free Cuba cannot be built on denial. It must be built on clarity about what happened, who was harmed, and what cannot be permitted again. The Communist Party, through words and deeds, has forfeited the right to participate in that process. We are seeing a lot of this accountability starting in U.S. courts, but we need to ramp up our efforts, pool our resources, and make sure that this never happens again 90 miles from U.S. shores, and that we don't become a haven for these people ever again. All right, I'll stop at that time.
Hoy, por sus importancias, por la información que nos han dado, vamos a discutir en el panel, o a presentar en el panel 4 de ellos, es decir, vamos a estar hablando del informe número 2, o presentando el informe número 2 que habla sobre marco jurídico y tránsito constitucional, un modelo de la ley a la ley. Vamos a estar hablando también del aporte de la diáspora en la reconstrucción de Cuba. Vamos a estar hablando de una hoja de ruta para la transición en Cuba. Y por último, cómo sanar el daño económico del cubano causado por el totalitarismo. Ahora, me presentar el informe número 12, que precisamente habla sobre la transición en Cuba basada en 3 pilares fundamentales: memoria histórica, justicia transicional y reconciliación nacional. Como siempre, en cada uno de los informes hablamos de la visión y de las propuestas para el futuro de Cuba. Daniel decía en principio que estos informes son productos, o sea, no son de un solo autor, que se lleva un pequeño colectivo de autores, sino que es una serie de autores que, en su caso, en este caso, por ejemplo, somos 36 personas que firman el informe. Este es la sede de descarga y siempre también hacemos la diferenciación de las personas que son de la lista y de la diáspora, ¿sí? Para balancear la autoría, ¿no? Al final, cada uno de los informes, específicamente este, pero todo sigue un índice bastante semejante en cuanto a la estructura. Hay una cápita de conceptos, hay una cápita de visión para cada uno de los puntos que se analicen en cada caso, una cápita de objetivos, unas estrategias concretas para cumplir esos objetivos, unas leyes que se proponen para alcanzar, en el caso específico de este que estamos viendo ahora, una transición en Cuba. Y en el caso de este informe número 12 presentamos una hoja de ruta para la transición como creemos que debe ser, ordenada, ágil y eficaz para Cuba. En el caso específico del informe número 2, que es el que ha presentado anteriormente Daniel, se detalla muchísimo con este paquete de 45 leyes, porque específicamente es un informe dedicado al marco jurídico y a las leyes complementarias de Cuba. Partiendo de los conceptos, por supuesto, en este caso del informe número 12, pues se habla de los conceptos de transición, se habla de la transición como un proceso continuado, no como un momento específico, no como un momento pasajero, sino como un largo proceso que va a estar compuesto por diferentes etapas, que para el análisis metodológico, por supuesto, se divide en sectores, se puede analizar entonces la transición desde el punto de vista económico, desde el punto de vista político, y cómo influyen todas estas transformaciones en la vida social de cada cubano. Y bueno, se tienen en cuenta o se deben tener en cuenta, obviamente, algunos criterios para evaluar, que es lo que ha pasado muchas veces, que se lanza una reforma sin evaluar o sin analizar los efectos que pueda causar en cuanto a, por ejemplo, en este caso, quiénes son los actores, quién o quiénes pueden ser los actores o quiénes son los encargados o los que podrían llevar a cabo esta transición. Lo estamos viendo ahora en Venezuela, después de la captura de Maduro, después del 3 de febrero, podemos estar de acuerdo, ¿no?, con muchísimas de las cosas que han sucedido, pero algunos actores anteriores pues deben estar presentes. Bueno, pues eso también se analiza en este informe, en cuanto a quién o quiénes son aquellos con la acción política necesaria en el caso de la transición. También es el cómo puede ocurrir este momento de la transición, si es un proceso, si es a través de estrategias políticas, a través de la negociación, a través de pactos que sería necesario realizar, y bueno, las evidencias prácticas de que se está dando realmente ese proceso de transición. A través de elementos concretos como la Constitución, a través de la convocatoria de elecciones, a través de plebiscitos, de reformas que se puedan ir haciendo, pero que son evidentemente comprobables. Para concluir, por supuesto, que es la transición es un proceso mediante hombre y durante el cual determinadas reglas de juego son reformadas hasta producir ese nuevo orden democrático al que aspiramos en la Cuba futura. Existen dos etapas importantes en esta hoja de ruta para la transición política, que es la etapa de liberalización y la democratización, que evidentemente son etapas como una reacción química en equilibrio, son complementarias, no es que primero la antecede una a otra como un proceso biológico, sino como un proceso químico que está equilibrado en ambos procesos. La liberalización, que nos viene a hablar de esa ampliación de los derechos civiles y políticos, es decir, los derechos ciudadanos vetados, y la democratización, que ya habla un poco más de la representatividad política y de la delimitación del ejercicio del poder político. Es decir, la complementación de liberalización y democratización consideramos que son los dos elementos, o sea, las dos etapas necesarias en este proceso transicional para Cuba. Y así sucesivamente en el informe pues, se comienzan a hablar de los otros ejes temáticos que dan estructura al informe concreto, en este caso la memoria histórica. Lo vivimos no solo desde el punto de vista político, sino también dentro de nuestras propias instituciones. A veces pues obviamos y negamos la historia anterior, los trabajos anteriores. Nos alegra muchísimo, por ejemplo, estar hablando hoy aquí y que se haya mencionado también, por ejemplo, Humberto Calzada, porque a veces, muchísimas veces, dentro de nuestras propias instituciones, no vamos a las raíces. Recuerdo sobre eso del libro de Pedro, volver a las raíces, al final es eso, en poesía, ¿no? El concepto de memoria histórica. Ahora mismo la Iglesia cubana, por ejemplo, está celebrando los 40 años del encuentro nacional eclesial cubano y ha habido que sacar de todos los archivos, aún con protagonistas vivos, muchísimos materiales que la propia Iglesia no se ha encargado de diseminar en estos 40 años. Celebramos en el 2026. Y eso a veces pasa por problemas de protagonismo o, en el caso negativo, o sea, porque queremos borrar una historia pasada, que en el caso de la transición política en Cuba pues tendría que obviar si no queremos, precisamente porque se quieren obviar muchas cosas que se cometieron durante todo este proceso que no se quiere ver o que no se quiere sacar a la luz. Por eso es que la memoria histórica es ese esfuerzo constante y consciente de los grupos humanos para encontrar, rescatar y recordar el pasado sin rencores, con empatía, pero con rigurosidad. Y aquí juega un papel fundamental el concepto de verdad, es decir, el papel que juega la verdad a la memoria histórica, que son los que se encargan de la transición y que la transición no ocurra a través de una mentira institucional, que a veces desde la propia institución es lo que se viene propagando. Las características de esta memoria histórica pues, es un mecanismo de esclarecimiento de la violación de los derechos humanos, es un espacio plural de debate social sobre las versiones del pasado que prevalecen en función del futuro que se quiere construir, es un escenario propicio para el diálogo y la construcción de paz, es una forma de reconocimiento y también de dignificar a las víctimas, y además es una muestra de solidaridad que se va reconstruyendo el tejido social con esa empatía de la que hablábamos, pero con la rigurosidad necesaria para establecer responsables y establecer causas y consecuencias, obviamente. Por supuesto, incluye voces y experiencias sociales donde es prioritario el criterio, la opinión, el testimonio de cada una de las víctimas. Se propone también la creación de la Comisión de la Verdad como mecanismo extrajudicial, temporal, para conocer la verdad de lo ocurrido durante los años en que Cuba ha sufrido este sistema totalitario, en el que hemos vivido, y esclarecer cada una de estas violaciones, cada uno de estos atorreos a las libertades individuales del cubano y ofrecer una explicación a toda la sociedad. Es decir, esta es una entidad que se crea con este fin y, bueno, cuando se esclarece, pues podría, y sobre eso mantenerse también, como en otros casos hablando de la Defensoría del Pueblo y demás. La función de esta Comisión de la Verdad, pues contribuir, por supuesto, a ese esclarecimiento de lo que ha ocurrido, contribuir al reconocimiento de las víctimas como ciudadanos que en su momento o durante largo tiempo han sido violados sus derechos individuales, tiene también una función propositiva normativa, puesto que pueden elaborar propuestas dirigidas a la reparación de esas víctimas, a la compensación. Se realiza a través de la Comisión de la Verdad un esclarecimiento de los patrones y causas del conflicto. Se promueve que las experiencias apropiadas para el esclarecimiento de la verdad se posicionen durante un largo plazo en la agenda de trabajo y se ofrece una explicación convincente de los hechos que han ocurrido a toda la sociedad, es decir, a un sector mucho más amplio que a la propia víctima. El segundo punto del informe, venimos haciendo después memoria histórica, justicia transicional. Le agregamos restaurativa e integral. La justicia transicional gira en torno a esos 4 elementos básicos que se ven acá en la diapo, es decir, la penalización de los responsables, la búsqueda incesante de la verdad, la reparación de las víctimas y la reforma de las instituciones públicas. Y el objetivo que persigue la justicia transicional es dilucidar los hechos y los contextos en los que ha ocurrido la violencia, combatir esa comunidad, resarcir a las víctimas por el daño que han sufrido y además pedir la repetición de los eventos que le ocasionaron en un momento determinado. Esta comprende mecanismos de protección, judicialización, reparación de las víctimas, sanación y empoderamiento, para que se conviertan en actores en su propia vida y motores principales del desarrollo y la realización plena de su proyecto de vida en una sociedad libre. Además, la justicia integral comprende la transformación profunda y ágil de todo el marco jurídico, del que estuvimos hablando, del que hablaba anteriormente Daniel, del Estado de Derecho y de una democracia bajo el estado de legalidad. Los cuatro pilares que se definen en el informe, que están descritos y explicados como pilares de la justicia transicional, tenemos a la verdad, la justicia, la reparación y la no repetición del daño. Y los mecanismos creados para que se den estos cuatro elementos, es decir, de verdad, justicia, reparación y no repetición del daño, es la propia Comisión de la Verdad de la que hemos hablado anteriormente, las amnistías, el proceso de ilustración, el proceso de preparación y los juicios. Y el tercer elemento que aborda este informe, memoria histórica, justicia transicional, restaurativa e integral, y el tercer elemento, reconciliación nacional, es quizá el proceso que, como depende del factor humano, pues podría ser uno de los más difíciles. En el cuarto momento del panel, pues estaríamos hablando del daño antropológico ocasionado por el totalitarismo en Cuba y cómo sanarlo, es decir, un proceso, un proyecto para la sanación. Y precisamente tiene mucho que ver con esto de reconciliación nacional, porque como habla de personas, ya no es la economía, es la salud pública, una política en el sector agrícola, pues estamos hablando del contenido humano, de la persona humana, pues quizás sea uno de los procesos más difíciles en esa Cuba del día después, por la venganza, por el odio, por la violencia, sencillamente por socializar el daño, por visibilizarlo, y por eso son procesos complementarios. Sin perder la memoria histórica, llegar a ese proceso de reconciliación nacional, que lo que hace es precisamente, como dice la primera sentencia, reconstruir esas relaciones dañadas, a partir de que las relaciones sociales, partiendo de que están lesionadas, fracturadas, quebrantadas completamente, pues pasar. Y es también como el objetivo de esta conferencia, pasar de la queja a la propuesta, pues la extrapolada aquí sería pasar de ese daño al abrazo de todo, como decía Sebastián al principio, las palabras de bienvenida al panel. El proceso de reconciliación, por supuesto, no es inmediato, se consigue a mediano y también a largo plazo, pero se debe comenzar y cada uno de nosotros debe comenzar a sanar desde dentro, pues para lograr ese abrazo de todos los cubanos. No habrá verdadero proceso de reconciliación sin que en su hoja de ruta se realicen procesos coadyuvantes, sinérgicos e integrales, como los que hablábamos anteriormente. El rescate o la rectificación de la memoria histórica, la búsqueda de la verdad de los hechos, los procesos, si no se dan aquellos 5 mecanismos de los que hablábamos: ilustración, preparación, juicios, pero para llegar siempre a esta reconciliación entre todos los cubanos de la isla y de la diáspora. Como decía, en la estructura de cada informe, pues tenemos una visión que es cómo deseamos la Cuba de mañana. Evidentemente está escrita en presente como si ya estuviéramos en ese futuro deseable. Cuba realiza un proceso de transición pacífico, ordenado, ágil y eficaz. Es como una tiene que, tenemos todo lo otro intuitivo, ¿no? Realizar un proceso de transición pacífico, ordenado, ágil y eficaz, que tendrá como principio y sentido la primacía y plena dignidad de la persona humana, así como la búsqueda del bien común de la sociedad. Este proceso incluye los subprocesos que hemos hablado anteriormente: memoria histórica y verdad, justicia transicional, restaurativa e integral, y la reconciliación a mediano y largo plazo. Si faltara alguno de ellos, la transición fracasaría, o en tiempos venideros se volverían a abrir las heridas cerradas y falsos por la ausencia de uno de estos componentes de una verdadera transición. Aquí nos queremos apoyar en algunos estudios o algunas interpretaciones que han realizado otros medios, en este caso específicamente este es un trabajo de Norman Rodríguez, donde combina varios de los informes. Aquí ha incorporado incluso el informe de Ecología y Medio Ambiente, para centrar que la visión del centro como tal, con toda la producción de sus informes de estudios, es el desarrollo humano integral, en una sola frase, en un solo concepto. Por eso es que habla aquí un poco de la dimensión económica y de la dimensión ecológica, pero nosotros nos basamos mayormente y creemos que es el fundamento de cada una de las otras reformas que pueden tener lugar en Cuba, esta dimensión cívica. Es decir, una sociedad que se empodera, una sociedad que camina hacia la democracia, contando con los dos pulmones que conforman el único cuerpo social cubano, que es la diaspora. Este es nuestro pulmón. Los informes, como decía, también tienen una serie de objetivos, en algunos casos más o menos largos, algunos objetivos generales, objetivos específicos por cada uno de los temas que se aborden. En este caso, pues, aquí están anunciados unos 9 objetivos específicos que hablan de crear una mesa de diálogo nacional que viene muy en sintonía con la cuestión de reconciliación nacional y con los puntos aquellos que hablábamos, quién, cómo y cuáles son las evidencias. Lo tuvimos ya en algún momento cuando el restablecimiento de relaciones diplomáticas entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, quizás las evidencias o los mecanismos de evaluación que fueron los más eficaces, y pues salió de un lado o de otro, y los resultados no sabemos cuáles fueron. Pues bueno, esa mesa de diálogo, no cerrarnos a esa mesa de diálogo, pero sí saber que todas las piezas estén, las piezas, como llamamos nosotros, de rompecabezas nacionales que puestos sobre la mesa, para contar entonces con actores válidos, con personas que conozcan la realidad cubana desde dentro y desde fuera y puedan influir en la toma de decisiones. Y por supuesto no cerrarnos por aquello de la revancha, de la venganza, de que si no se hace primero tal cosa, es decir, la cuestión del juicio, la cuestión de la navegación moral, pues no me siento a la mesa porque primero hay que hacer esto y aquello. Por algo hay que empezar y el concepto debe ser, pues, aunar reflexión post de la reconciliación nacional. Un segundo objetivo sería gestionar un nuevo pacto social mediante un marco constitucional, con la elección de una asamblea constituyente, uno redactar una constitución donde verdaderamente participemos todos los cubanos. Después, cuando estamos hablando un poquito de la discusión, específicamente sobre el informe número 2 del marco jurídico y el tránsito constitucional, hablaríamos un poco de esa reforma constitucional, muy diferente a lo que sucedió en los años 2018 y 2019 para aprobar la nueva constitución de la República de Cuba de 2019, que de nueva solo tiene el eslogan. ¿Okay? Un tercer objetivo sería la creación de esa propia comisión, lo que estábamos hablando, la creación de la Comisión de la Verdad y Memoria Histórica, una comisión de trabajo, la creación de un programa integral de reconciliación nacional, aprobar, y por supuesto también está entre el paquete de las 45 leyes complementarias, ese marco jurídico que se propone en el informe número 2, es decir, aprobar la ley de abolición total o irrevocable de la pena de muerte, aprobar la primera ley de ilustración y solicitar el apoyo y el asesoramiento de personalidades y organizaciones intermedias, es decir, organizaciones de la sociedad civil en proceso de transición, porque no somos los únicos, quizás sí uno de los regímenes más duraderos de este color político, pero tenemos la experiencia, o podemos contar con la experiencia de otros países cuyos procesos de transición han podido ser exitosos o por lo menos modélicos para Cuba. Y en un último objetivo, aprobar una ley de partidos políticos que regule la creación, funcionamiento y financiamiento de los partidos políticos. En Cuba decimos que existen muchos partidos políticos, pero sucede como muchas otras organizaciones de la sociedad civil independiente, que no existe un registro de asociaciones, por tanto, legalmente solo existe un único partido, así como el gobierno, por ejemplo, llama think tanks o centros de estudio también, o laboratorios de pensamiento, a los CDR, a organizaciones políticas y demás. Existe una serie, se desglosa en el informe una serie de estrategias que ya sí son más explicativas de cómo desarrollar cada uno de esos objetivos, es decir, en el cómo llevarlo a cabo, cómo implementarlo. Específicamente este informe presenta 32 estrategias para implementarlo y una serie de propuestas de leyes para llegar a esa transición en Cuba. Empezando, por supuesto, con la ratificación de los pactos internacionales de derechos humanos, que Cuba firmó y debe ratificar por respetar los convenios de la Organización del Trabajo, por respetar también lo que ha firmado con otras agencias de Naciones Unidas, respetar la Constitución o crear una nueva Constitución, como estuvimos hablando anteriormente, y las nuevas leyes que se complementan con esos pactos y tratados. Redactar esa nueva Constitución, que no es la de 2019, la ley de memoria histórica, la ley o decreto de creación de la Comisión de la Verdad, de reparación de las víctimas, la implementación de la ley del defensor del pueblo, una nueva ley de partidos políticos y la ley de abolición de la pena de la muerte. Por último, y por supuesto que también se desarrolla en el informe, más allá de esta tabla, pues establecemos pareamos en un lado, en la columna izquierda, los problemas a resolver y en la columna derecha las propuestas de solución. Ante el caos y la violencia que podría generar esa transición en Cuba, pues establecemos un estado de ayuda pacífica, ordenada y eficaz. Ante la vida valentina en la que vive cubano, la que hemos estado sufriendo durante todos estos años, que es el daño que ha ocasionado el poder totalitario precisamente en la persona, pues el proceso de verdad. Ante la pérdida de la memoria histórica, esa que hablamos de la importancia de su rescate, pues ese rescate necesario a través de los mecanismos que sean necesarios implementar para ello. Ante la impunidad, el proceso de justicia transicional, un proceso de justicia integral. Ante la vulnerabilidad de las víctimas, el proceso de reparación y rehabilitación de ellas. Ante el odio y la venganza, la educación. La educación cívica, que a pesar de que sea superflua, de que sea lo menos importante, es al final el basamento humano con el que contamos para protagonizar esa transición. Si partimos de ciudadanos dañados, pues no sabemos cuál será el producto final, cuál será la calidad. Ante la división o fragmentación de la nación cubana, ese proceso de reconciliación nacional, ese abrazo de todos del que nos hablaba Sebastián, y ante el cambio esencial e irreversible del viejo régimen, un proceso de instauración y consolidación de un Estado de Derecho, de una democracia de calidad, y al final, de lo que estábamos hablando hace un momento atrás, de esa visión, que al final es la visión completa del ser, que es el camino hacia el desarrollo humano integral. Esta hoja de ruta, evidentemente, pues, estará dividida en fases, una fase de estabilización, una fase de transformación y una fase de consolidación. Lo mismo que hablamos en términos de mediano, o sea, corto, mediano y largo plazo. Hablando de unos 10 años, evidentemente lo más difícil, quizá para el cambio en Cuba, es la restauración del ethos cubano, es decir, del cuerpo social cubano, porque ha sido dañado durante tanto tiempo que quizás ni siquiera estamos preparados para la vida en libertad o vamos a cometer los mismos errores en los que hemos ocurrido durante todos los años. Pero bueno, aquí se divide también en cada una de esas fases cuáles podrían ser las líneas principales. Entonces, hasta acá.
Le dijo mi nombre, Juan Carlos Martínez, trabajo en Ciencias Políticas y yo voy a hablar sobre eso y de alguna manera andaba por la crisis demográfica que la crisis demográfica presente, no caballo el canal de lo que está sucediendo con la dinámica demográfica no es otra cosa que denunciar la presencia de la influencia de los factores que están afectando a la población y por eso la dinámica demográfica está cambiando de esa manera. Bueno, yo digo otra especie de apagón de 12, 13, 14 horas, 16 horas no van, sí, no pueden reducir eso, no podemos ir sigamos. Pero bueno, así que al menos voy a estar un cambio y después la podemos abordar. Voy a tratar de responder 4 preguntas, cómo llegó hasta acá, cómo han funcionado las variables demográficas en esa dinámica y qué lección se pueden extraer en términos de integración con el desarrollo y además qué podemos esperar para el futuro, al menos próximo. Yo no me voy a atrever a hablar nunca de más allá de 5 o 10 años. Y ya como un año de más continuo. Bueno, la población cubana viene descendiendo desde el 2005, el censo actual no es nuevo. Viene desde el 2005. La última vez que aumentó la población cubana fue en el 2005, ella venía ralentizando y a partir del 2005 es una tasa que empezó a fluctuar alrededor del cero, como una caída, y ya empieza una caída sostenida, en la cual las migraciones empiezan a jugar un papel muy importante. Es decir, las barras oscuras no es otra cosa que cuál sería la población cubana si no hubiera existido la migración. Estaríamos hablando de una población que estaría ya muy próxima o sobrepasando los 12 millones, que no quiere decir ni que sea bueno ni que sea malo, estoy diciendo nada más que la influencia que ha tenido la inmigración cubana en los últimos años, por lo menos, desde 1960 hasta acá, con años muy activos, como ya hemos comentado. Y esto es lo que se alcanza hoy. Se ha alcanzado un proceso al que vamos a llamar vaciamiento demográfico, que tiene que ver con la sexta oleada migratoria grande que ha tenido el país, para retomar las 5 primeras que escribió en su artículo, pero que esta tiene la peculiaridad que es la oleada migratoria más grande de la historia de Cuba. Y superando, por ejemplo, en disminución de individuos, todas las víctimas ocurridas en la última década de 1895-1898. Hay un vaciamiento demográfico, vaciamiento del 31 de diciembre de 2024, un poco más de 8 millones de personas. La ONEI hace una estimación muy interesante. Para la ONEI la población va a seguir creciendo en el futuro. Para la ONEI quiero decir la Oficina Nacional de Estadística, como si la realidad no se hiciera, es decir, que la fecundidad alcanza su unidad y alcanza el nivel de retraso, y que la migración desaparecerá. Eso aparece en el documento oficial de proyecciones del país, aunque ellos no explican por qué. Ellos dicen lo que ellos suponen, pero nunca lo explican. Entonces, la estimación de la ONEI, ellos nunca quisieron reconocer esta caída, no quisieron reconocer la magnitud real de la oleada migratoria última que ha ocurrido, pero no tuvieron más remedio que hacer una estimación un poco más realista, que fuera que presentara la Asamblea Nacional de 9.7 millones de habitantes, pero que efectivamente no corrige ciertos errores de los cuales podemos hablar, y por eso se les queda muy alta la estimación de la población. Era en los años 70 una pirámide de población clásica, población joven, que se convirtió en una población ya entrando en una fase avanzada de vejez demográfica, un envejecimiento muy importante de la estructura general de la población. Esto es el 31 de diciembre de 2021. Bueno, y no quise dejar pasar el momento para mostrar, el área roja en la pirámide anterior, ¿ya? Y el área azul ahora es la pirámide que ha quedado después de la oleada migratoria 2024. ¿Ok? Y ya ven que en términos de composición, lo que le ha pasado a la población es que la migración, que no había jugado un papel tan claro en el envejecimiento de la estructura de edad de la población, ahora sí lo está haciendo, porque no solo ha consolidado ese proceso que venía de antes, sino que ahora le está quitando a la población selectivamente población joven. El 80% de los que se han ido están entre 15 y 59 años. Bueno, en fecundidad, maltusianismo de la pobreza. Las personas perciben el nacimiento de un hijo adicional como un riesgo para la supervivencia de la familia. Y lo que vemos es que hay una caída importantísima del número de nacimientos, que es el resultado de esa caída de la fecundidad. Hoy está Cuba, en 2024, 1.29 hijos por mujer. Eso es incluso más bajo que el promedio europeo, y está a la altura del promedio del sudeste asiático, en ausencia de desarrollo, que es la peculiaridad. Fíjense las caídas en el número de nacimientos. En fin, ese número de 7.999 era el número de nacimiento del año 1899. El número de nacimientos del 24 fue 71.000. Y el de este año es 68.000, a pesar de incluso un error de sobreestimación que tiene. Pero, para que den una idea de lo que está pasando, porque es una contribución también muy importante de la migración. Se están yendo 133 mujeres por cada 100 hombres, es decir, se están yendo lo que en demografía se llama mujeres paridoras, mujeres que, por muy alta que sea la comunidad, van a aportar siempre un número reducido de nacimientos. Esto tiene que ver con mucho, no solo con la migración, tiene que ver mucho con el aborto. Es decir, en Cuba existe una epidemia del aborto, como lo han definido otros investigadores. Pero fíjense que entre 1985 y el 2025, 5,9 millones de interrupciones de embarazo. O sea, hay una cultura que viene incluso de la primera mitad del siglo XX, pero que se ha acelerado y se ha dado a constituir en una epidemia de aborto. Fíjense que la tasa global de abortos, que es el número medio de abortos por mujer, supera al número de hijos por mujer. Y no va a subir la fecundidad porque las mujeres que están terminando ya, que culmina su periodo de vida fértil, también están aportando una descendencia femenina que está también por debajo del nivel de reemplazo, menos de una hija por mujer. En fin, en términos de mortalidad, un proceso que se ha dado en llamar fragilidad demográfica, es decir, el estancamiento del proceso y la reversión de las tendencias. Lo que muestran los gráficos es que en 2013 la esperanza de vida está bajando en Cuba, a pesar de que hay un muy controversial descenso de la mortalidad infantil, sobre el cual estamos discutiendo todavía, y eso afecta tanto a hombres como a mujeres. La diferencia con relación a periodo especial fue que la esperanza de vida que más bajó más rápido, fue la femenina, no la masculina. Y eso afecta cualquier color de piel. Esto es población blanca, población no blanca. Lo que es notorio es el impacto sobre la población no blanca, de la cual nunca se logró eliminar la desventaja. Y en los hombres, por ejemplo, a la altura del 2017, ya los hombres negros están por debajo de 70 años, están en 66 años. Bueno, y esto fue lo que sucedió hacia los últimos años, periodo especial. La esperanza de vida hubiera seguido bajando. El impacto de COVID, ese 21 con asterisco, sería lo que hubiera bajado la esperanza de vida si no hubiera entrado COVID en Cuba. Las últimas barras son la caída de la esperanza de vida, uniendo todos los efectos. Ya ven que no solo son los hombres negros los que están por debajo de 70 años, también lo están todos los hombres por debajo de 70 años. Y las mujeres son pérdidas muy grandes, entre 6.34 y 5.96 años de pérdida en general que tuvo la esperanza de vida. Bueno, al final es esto, ¿no? Es que la caída no puede ser detenida de la capacidad de supervivencia, y ahora lo novedoso es el incremento que está teniendo de manera sostenida la mortalidad infantil. Ha llegado a ser el último dato oficial, que fue el último dato que publicaron, 9.9. Yo tengo hecho una estimación corregida que ya alrededor de 14. Pero bueno, todavía me falta por ver. Las migraciones, bueno, lo que yo iba a llamar la pérdida de la simetría de los sujetos que escapan. La gente se va para donde quiera. Como dicen los niños, como dijeron los niños de Santiago de Cuba en aquella investigación, su deseo central, en un ejercicio de diga sus 5 deseos preferidos, los niños dijeron salir del país. Pero que eso es interesante porque no dicen irme de Cuba, es salir del país. Eso es un concepto muy abstracto para un niño. Y lo manifiestan de esa manera. Y efectivamente lo que está sucediendo, esas son las oleadas, aquellas son las oleadas antes del 2020, y estas son todas las oleadas. Fíjense que la última oleada prácticamente saca de marco todo lo demás. En fin. Y como ven, otra parte de la ciclicidad es que ya no hay una pérdida. No hay una salida asimétrica entera, América del Norte, Estados Unidos y Europa, preferentemente España. A la vez son 140 destinos diferentes a los que está viajando lo que está saliendo. Bueno, ya Nicaragua puso visa para ir a Nicaragua, ahora todos están yendo para Guyana. En fin, la otra simetría, si vamos a comprensión, sin nombre. Y bueno, el canario de la mina es esto. Va a seguir bajando la población inexorablemente, porque los factores que están funcionando van a seguir funcionando y no se está haciendo nada para que esos factores no dejen de usar, funcionar. Y las personas, bueno, como pasa en todo proceso migratorio, las personas siempre van a buscar donde se vive mejor. Y los factores que hoy están presentes en Cuba, no me he detenido en ellos porque no tiempo, son tan fuertes que hacen que las personas decidan con mucho abandonar su lugar. Lo voy a dejar acá para dejar un poco de margen esto es lo que va a ocurrir en la estructura de edades. Esta es la oleada, lo que fue el baby boom se va a convertir en 2030 de la población en un sistema de pensiones, como vamos a ver después, como Carmelo ha señalado, está en crisis porque es insostenible. Lo que fue el baby boom se va a convertir en el punto de la jubilación. Eso sin contar que el gobierno cubano ha montado una política natalista que si la lograra, tendrían entonces simultáneamente en 2030 el punto de la jubilación y otro baby boom. ¿Cómo lo van a financiar?
Imposible.
Bueno,
Van a hacer un baby boom.
La fuerza de trabajo se está cerrando la ventana de oportunidad demográfica. Quiere decir que dentro de muy poco ya dejará de ser sostenible la población no activa con relación a la activa. Y bueno, es un proceso en el cual la principal fuente sería el modelo.
Pues no es ni el número de población, ni cómo las personas se quieren comportar demográficamente, sino que hay un modelo que está empujando esta dinámica que, como bien ya decía Sergio Piqué, le podemos llamar el canal. Se lo dejo.
So I think it's going to be important during the transition process and even after to start considering or seeing if the conditions are there to lift those sanctions. But it's important to know that those sanctions should be removed when the necessary conditions in Cuba exist and when those conditions meet the terms of the Helms-Burton Law. You know, the law has specific terms for those restrictions on and for the embargo to be lifted. So those conditions have to be met on the side of the United States as long as the embargo is in place. But also the expansion of trade and investment, again, not only in the region, but internationally, could provide Cuba with necessary resources to modernize not only the economy, but to improve the living standards of Cubans and to rebuild, like Luis was saying, the country basically from the bottom up. At the same time, the U.S. policymakers would need to ensure that economic engagement does not exacerbate inequality or create dependency. So there's other scenarios where you get into a trap of dependency, of inequality expanding. So you want to try to mitigate that as much as possible. And a thoughtful approach would emphasize sustainable development, entrepreneurship, and integration into regional and international markets. So again, opening up the economy more broadly and helping the Cuban people build resilience in this new democratic era in economic terms. In terms of security, obviously a very important issue with U.S.-Cuba relations. Migration flows, counter-narcotics cooperation, and regional stability are all issues that would demand attention through this transition. The United States would want to make sure that these issues are addressed and are don't explode during this transition period and the uncertainty that it can bring. The U.S. would need to work closely with the new transitional Cuban government to manage these challenges, ensuring that the transition does not create vulnerabilities that could destabilize Cuba or the broader Caribbean. And building trust through transparent collaboration would be key to addressing these shared concerns. Cultural and social ties, and this has been mentioned already. The role of the exile community and the Cuban diaspora, whatever term people want to use, is very important and is critical. In this case, in particular, it offers a unique opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Cuba, especially that you have now a few generations of Cuban Americans, people that consider themselves part of both cultures and can navigate in some way in both. You have Cuban American communities with deep connections to the island, with know-how, right, in different fields that can then translate that know-how to help Cuba rebuild. Can serve as a bridge between the two nations. Here I emphasize real, when talking about people-to-people contacts and people-to-people diplomacy, I stress the word real because we've heard people-to-people mentioned in other contexts and promoted by other administrations, but it falls flat when in reality it's applied in the current context. But when there's a real democratic transition and those restrictions on speech and on movement and on society in general are lifted, and you really have people going to Cuba to really be able to freely interact with the Cuban people, and you have real cultural exchanges that are not censored and are not dictated by the regime, this would really help decades of estrangement in some aspects, and to foster mutual understanding and really show the world what Cuba is, right? Not the version that has been kind of painted or sold under the current regime. And these human connections may ultimately prove as important as political or economic policies in shaping the future of U.S.-Cuba relations. This is basically a version of soft power that the United States has, but it's also if you want to think of it, and I don't know if I'm going beyond the term, but it's almost a form of soft power that the Cuban or Cuban American community has on its own, because this community has developed its own traditions or has maintained a lot of the traditions of Cuba that were lost and have been lost in the last 67 years. So it's a way of kind of bringing back those traditions, those cultures, or those cultural celebrations or pillars that in some way were lost or eroded. Now, the variables that I mentioned, and there's some others, but these are some of the key ones. One very important one is the U.S. administration in place. So the question is this going to occur during the current administration that seems to be talking a different game in terms of the relationship of the U.S. with Cuba, or is it going to be under another administration with another president who may not be prioritizing some sort of a transition in Cuba, or who might have another vision on Cuba altogether? The makeup of the U.S. Congress. Will the president, whoever that president is, have a majority or a minority in Congress, and how will that play a role in U.S. relations during that transition? Raul Castro's life expectancy is another one, right? I say this about a 90-something-year-old man, so it sounds kind of comical, but when we're talking about, and these variables kind of stack up on each other. So when you talk about a president who has 3 years left in office, and a man who is in his 90s, but will he live 3 years? Will he die before the next administration? Will he continue another year or so? It's important because he's still the figure that keeps it all together. He's the last kind of symbolic link to that revolutionary generation. He's perceived as the person with the firm grasp on power. He's the person that really is pulling the strings. So whether Diaz-Canel leaves or not, that's a whole other question, and that's not as much of a factor as whether Raul Castro is still in the picture or not. Also, going kind of tied to that question is the leadership of the Communist Party. Who would be coming next after Raul Castro if Raul Castro ends up dying? Who would replace him? What would the priorities of that individual or that leadership be? What would be the reaction of the Revolutionary Armed Forces and the Ministry of the Interior and their forces on the ground? Would they unite? Would they divide? What would happen there? Would Cuba meet under the transition, depending on how the transition takes place, and how long would it take Cuba to meet the terms of the Helms-Burton Law, right, in terms of democratic institutions, democratic processes, and will it happen quickly? Will it happen? Will it be drawn out? That's another question, right? And then finally, the role of global powers in helping promote the transition and playing a role in supporting a democratic transition in Cuba, but also the role of those countries who are spoilers, who are not seeking a democratic transition in Cuba, primarily China, Russia, Iran, and others, right? So what role are those country is going to play during this period. So those are some of the variables. Again, they all kind of stack up on each other, but those are things that can either make the transition process longer and easier, or sorry, shorter and easier, or longer and harder. And it's hard to tell, but it's important to consider them when we're talking about potential. Not only a potential transition, but U.S.-Cuba relations during that period. That's it.
Okay, so I think we're ready to start. Hopefully more people will come up during the next few minutes. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the former director of the Cuban Research Institute here at FIU, and I have been asked to chair this very diverse panel session. It'll be interesting to see if we can find some common threads. And my role is simply to introduce the speakers and then, make sure that they keep time. Each one will have about 20 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So hopefully we'll have a lot of questions and answers. So following the program, I'll just introduce our first speaker, Arturo Felipe Hernandez from the University of Nottingham in UK. He's going to be speaking about restoration, reform, or provisionality, constitutional architecture for Cuba's democratic transition. Then secondly, Maciel Medina from the University of Miami will speak about cases of transnational citizenship through Cristina Garcia's Vanishing Maps and Daenerys Mercado Ventas Las 90 Habanas. And finally, Nicolás Sánchez from the College of the Holy Cross will speak about 10 short tributes to American education by a Cuban exile. So without further ado, Arturo.
Okay. First, I'd like to say thank you to the FIU CRI for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad to be here presenting for you guys today. The topic that I'm speaking about is transitional constitutionalism. And when I say transitional constitutionalism, I'm talking specifically about the constitutional structures that are adopted during a transition, which could be distinguished from permanent constitutionalism, in that permanent constitutionalism is created by a constituent assembly. And so I'm only talking about the transition, right? Otherwise, we could be here for a long time. The other thing that I want to say is that this is a constitutionalism generally, and transitional constitutionalism specifically requires, there's a lot of considerations that go into these things. Obviously, like everything legal is very complex. And so because of the limited time that I have, I'm going to have to skim through certain things and just breeze through. But yeah, so I'm just making that disclaimer. Now, I want to say this before I continue, because I think it's important to emphasize that the permanent constitution of Cuba must be created by a free and sovereign Cuban people for a free and sovereign Cuba. I think that history has shown us that when external powers, whether they be the United States, whether they be the Soviet Union, so on and so forth, get involved in dictating what the Cuban people have wanted to do, or, get involved in dictating things to the Cuban people, I think that it's caused a lot of problems, again, both irrespective of who is intervening, right? So I think it's important to make that distinction at the very beginning. Right, so now what is a constitution, right? The basic principles and laws of a nation, state, or social group that determine the powers and duties of government and guarantee certain rights to the people in it, which on its face sounds good. Until you remember, of course, that states like the former Soviet Union, Russia, so on and so forth, right? Think about the Soviet Union under Stalin. They also have and have had a constitution, right? Which prompts the question, okay, well, if a constitution isn't enough to give us the ends that we're trying to establish, then what is it that we need in order for the Constitution to be able to effectuate what it is that a vast majority of the population wants to get from a Constitution, right? And that's the distinction as between the Constitution and constitutionalism, right? Constitutionalism is within a given polity, the untrammeled freedom of action of every actor operating within that polity is constrained by the law, right? So in contrast to a constitution, right? Where a constitution creates the structures which delineate what the government, the structure of the government and the branches of the government. Constitutionalism is the institution of those entities under the law, under the Constitution itself, such that the entities under the Constitution have to respond directly to the law and can only operate as within the scope of the law, right? So that's a distinction between a constitution and constitutionalism. What that leads to is that what is important for Cuba to do, irrespective of the way that the process unfolds in Cuba, in order for anything else to actually play out, Cuba must establish the rule of law, right? The institution of private property, the recreation of economic systems, the human rights framework are illusory if the rule of law is not established in Cuba. There are no economic protections if the rule of law in Cuba is not instituted. And so I think that regardless of all other things that you should take from this presentation is that Cuba, the moment that the time comes, Cuba must establish the rule of law above anything else. Now I'm gonna transition to, no pun intended, to transitional constitutionalism. Now, transitional constitutionalism has three elements, right? It is the creation of a deliberation body, so things that we're familiar with, right? So a council or an executive, something like that. It lays a path forward for reform. So constitutional change, the creation of assemblies, the institution of elections, it lays that path forward. And very importantly, it has a temporal limitation. So it creates an expiration date for itself. And we'll go into why that's important coming up. Right. So now I'm going to mention some goals of transitional constitutionalism. Right. And obviously, like I said before, there's a lot of stuff goes into this, but I'm just cherry picking 5 of the main kind of elements that go into transitional constitutionalism. Right. So you have sequencing and process design. I think I alluded to this earlier. Right. So it creates a concrete process for the negotiation of a permanent constitution. Right. So it sets the rules for the creation of permanent constitutionalism. It sets, for example, elections and so on and so forth. It facilitates the reestablishment of popular legitimacy through delineation of elections, right? So I mentioned that. That's one of the main factors. The other is it has a functional component and a symbolic component. The functional component, obviously, is that transitional constitutionalism allows for the legal rebirth of the nation, right? In an actual way, right? By undoing the law that was there before and by replacing that law, you have a functional change of the legal system. But also there's a symbolic change, right? You know, when you're transitioning from a Marxist legal system or a Marxist-inclined legal system to a democratic legal system by rupturing that legality, right? It allows for a symbolic reinstitution of the law, right? And then lastly, with regard to legal rebirth, it operationalizes and entrenches the supremacy of the law. Another big aspect of this, and I think that my colleagues in the last panel were referring to this at least a little bit, is the transitional justice function of transitional constitutionalism, right? So one of the main aspects of transitional constitutionalism is that it has to impart, or it should impart, frameworks and institutions that allow for transitional justice. And when I say transitional justice, I'm talking about accountability for violations of human rights by the prior regime. I'm talking about recognition of the type of things that regime did, and so on and so forth, by making them clear and holding them accountable for the things that they have done. And then also restitution. I didn't add another one, but I think it's important to mention. I think reconciliation is also part of that transitional justice framework, simply because the only way that we as a Cuban and Cuban American community can actually do something worthwhile and change the course of this ship is not only through all of these things that I just mentioned, but also through reconciliation. The fourth element, obviously, is an obvious one: state administration, right? So part of the things that a transitional constitution has to do is that it has to create or co-opt certain structures to allow it to do what a state is supposed to do: take care of the people, defense, food, electricity, so on and so forth, right? Goods and services, food, all that. And then also part of that as well, of the state administration, is that a transitional administration will be the representatives for a transition government, right? And so they're going to do all of the foreign relations stuff that are necessary in order to rebuild what's left behind. And then this last one is a peacemaking function, right? The only way that a transitional government could have any basis without imputed violence is through peacemaking. And so transitional constitutionalism and the creation of a transitional constitution facilitates that peacemaking process by getting everyone involved, all of the actors involved in whoever they may be, involved in transforming violence or, things like violence into actual state production, right? All of the energy that would be utilized for violence and chaos, right, through the peacemaking function of transitional constitutionalism is channeled toward the recreation of a new state. Right. So this is who can do transitional constitutionalism, and the answer is not a simple one, because it depends on a host of factors, all of which are unknown until the time that the current regime actually collapses. We don't know who's going to be involved in certain transfers. We don't know what we're going to see when I say we, I mean the exile community, what we're going to see when we finally get there, right? We don't know what the role of all of the actors that are necessary for this process, what it's going to be. But effectively, a transitional government is formed from all, or should be formed from all major stakeholders in a conflict, right? Now, whether that actually becomes manifest in practice is a different thing, right? So that naturally there are political incentives for both sides to exclude certain parties from the creation of a transitional government. And so, and in so doing, they could manipulate the political process in whichever ways they want. But ideally, all of the major stakeholders involved in transition would be included in the creation of a transitional document. And the reason why is because those persons or those groups that are not included could potentially spoil the process of creation for everyone else, right? It's going to take complete societal integration in order to get a transition government off the ground in an effective way, and through exclusion, that's how you would create a group of people that have a very significant interest in making sure that the transitional framework that you're putting into place is destroyed. That's not to say that everybody could be included at all times. Obviously, we know that that's not practical and nor realistic. But that is to say that all of the major stakeholders should be involved in the creation of a transitional constitutional document. Right. So now I'm going to speak about some of the main issues involved in the creation and establishment of a transitional constitutional order, right? The first one is a legitimacy gap. And what that means is that where a classically liberal democratic government is, at least theoretically, established by the people, right? In the name of the people, there are electoral mechanisms that allow people to vote for who they want to represent them, and then through that electoral chain, right, you have legitimacy for the final product being the Constitution. In the case of a transitional document, one of the issues is that the way that it has played out in almost all post-communist societies or post-conflict societies is that it's a round table made up of, again, all the stakeholders involved or many stakeholders involved in a conflict. But what that means is that there's no way, not that there's no way, there's no realistic opportunity for imputation of legitimacy through popular methods, right? You could say, for example, well, maybe those people could be elected, right? Maybe the people of the people who constitute the round table could be elected, right? But without some kind of framework in the first place to establish order, you can't have elections. So there's a legitimacy gap necessarily involved with transitional constitutionalism. Another problem that is implicated is that whoever is in charge is going to be in charge of doing many things at one time. Most notably, there's three things. They're going to be rebuilding a society, they're going to be rebuilding an economy, and they're going to be rebuilding a legal system all at one time. And what that means is that there's going to be compromises and trade-offs because there have to be, right? The most efficient way to institute an economy is not the most efficient way or the best way to institute a legal system. But that's going to be the task of what this government is going to have to do, right? So the implication is that there will be compromises from all sides, and that the product of a transitional government is not going to be perfect. It's going to be far from it. And so, yeah, that's another issue involved. I think a third issue is important, and it's path dependency. So experience in other post-communist transitions have taught us that there's great path dependency as between the transitional instrument and the final instrument being the Constitution created by the Constitutional Assembly. There's a lot of theories as to why that is, why there seems to be a link between the transitional document and the final document, but despite the different theories, that is actually what it appears to be in practice, right? That for some reason, the constitutional assemblies tend to fall back on whatever kind of institutions or structures were imposed in many ways by the transitional regime, right? Another thing to be wary about is populist regime capture, right? So in moments of transition, different actors, usually charismatic type actors, politicians, so on and so forth, arise from all kinds of places. And because there is an institutional vacuum, they mobilize their electorate, their constituency, right, in ways that is counter to democracies, right? So for a great example of that is what occurred in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, right? During the creation of the Venezuelan Constitution, right, and in calling an assembly and capturing a large portion of the electorate of that assembly, right? He manipulated democratic structures to his advantage. And so that's something that has to be kept in mind in the creation of a transitional document, namely that the tools of democracy could be utilized by people for ill gains. So let's not lose sight of that, right? Another big aspect of transitional constitutionalism is asset capture. And we all know what that looks like, right? The transition in Russia, for example, the creation of an oligarchy, the creation of, or the establishment of a super class, right? That all occurred through asset capture mechanisms. So during the transition from a privatized economy to a private economy, there necessarily is going to be people making decisions as to the state products, right? As to what the state currently does. There's going to be a transfer from the private institutions, from the public institutions to the private institutions. And within that opens up the door to asset capture. And that's obviously a dangerous thing. And then the last one is overstay, right? So the possibility that the transitional government manipulates the situation or fails intentionally for the purpose of perpetuating their power. And that's always a possibility, and that's why strict time limits and accountability institutions have to be built alongside of a transitional document to hold that transitional government accountable for the length of time that they're supposed to be there, and to not allow them to exercise powers that don't belong to them. Right, so now I'm going to go into comparing and contrasting the benefits or the detriments of the benefits and the detriments of adopting a particular path, right? So I'm going to go through this real quick. The benefits of keeping 2019 is that there are existing structures which are already in place. So if the current government collapses, right, there are people there that know their jobs, what has to be done, so on and so forth, right? Another benefit is speed. Because you don't have to rebuild a legal system, that allows you to be able to utilize the existing system and to focus on the creation of elections and the establishment of a constitutional assembly, right? The other benefit is that it could be used as a bargaining tool as between the old administration and the new administration, right? So you could keep 2019, obviously not in the way that it is because it's a Marxist constitution. It's a Marxist constitution and it needs to be amended. Nevertheless, it could be used as a bargaining tool. And then the third one is a practical implication, is that it limits the choices that a transitional government has, and in so limiting it, it reduces the points for fracture as between that transitional body. The drawbacks, I mean, I think they're obvious to everyone. Symbolic illegitimacy, which undercuts the transformational narrative. Marxist incompatibility. You could remove the Marxist words from the 2019 Constitution. It still contains Marxist DNA. And the way that I like to think of it is that you could remove the insignia off a Marxist uniform, but when you look at it, the first thing that you think of is the Marxist uniform. Another thing is paper rights. So the Constitution of 2019 has a lot of non-justiciable rights. The ideological contamination. Institutional gatekeeping is leaving the structures in place such that the structures themselves are manipulated by the people who are most familiar with those structures, and those people who are most familiar with those structures just so happen to be the people who the transition is meant to exclude, not on a political basis, but by virtue of the transition itself. And then again, the last one that I put is the potential for stickiness or path dependency. And obviously path dependency as between a Marxist constitution and a liberal constitutional assembly is non-compatible, right? So insofar as 1940 is concerned, there's a lot of benefits here. There also is a lot of drawbacks. And I'm going to try to go through this quickly so I don't take from my colleagues' time. The benefits are symbolic emotional power. That's the biggest one. The role that the Constitution of 1940 plays in the diaspora particularly is highly significant. The second is built-in legitimacy. I was referring to the legitimacy problem earlier, but one of the benefits of reinstituting 1940 is that there's a built-in legitimacy, namely because that Constitution was created by a constitutional assembly, right? Another benefit is immediate governability. So because it created an actual government and government structures, you can almost copy and paste, right? The personnel will change, but the idea won't. Another benefit is the staggered implementation. So the Constitution of 1940 created instruments and frameworks to allow for staggered implementation of that Constitution, right? Which is very similar to what would have to occur in a transition. There would necessarily have to be staggered implementation of, example, the electorate, of the Constitutional Assembly, of the implementation of the Constitution following the implementation of the legislature, right? And then I'm just going to go through the drawbacks really quickly. The interpretive divergence, right? There's a difference as between the way that we in the exile community perceive the Constitution in 1940 and the way that the current population of Cuba views it, namely because of the way that we've been taught about it. For domestic actors, and this is related, lack of familiarity with liberal democratic systems, right? And that creates a point for friction. Unfortunately, 1940 also has the issue of unenforceable rights, which could create a rule of law problem. This is a practical consideration, economic tie-downs, right? So there's a lot of things that the Constitution of 1940 establishes that are not necessarily possible or feasible within a transitional framework that utilizes the Constitution of 1940. Deconstitutionalization, that's way too complex for now. Lack of accessory legislation, which is implementation legislation that will be necessary to effectuate the postulates of the 1940 Constitution. And over-constitutionalization is related to that. And I'm just going to stop there because I don't want to impose on my colleagues. So we could talk about the rest of the stuff later. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.